Welcome to episode 2 of the Paradox podcast. Shams, it feels good to say that, right?
Yeah.
Honestly, we didn't know if we'd ever get to episode 2.
Are you kidding me? Of course we did. Like, everything we touch turns into DLC-infused gold. Of course we would get to episode 2. Well, except everything that doesn't go well. But
When are we doing the first DLC for the podcast? Q1 2018?
We actually released it on day 1. People just didn't notice.
Cosmetic DLC.
Yeah.
So you get like a voice filter, so you sound like,
Darth Vader, yeah.
That's right. But it feels good. I mean, it turns out people sort of listen, right? I mean, we're up to a couple of thousand listeners so far.
We got a lot of good responses. I got a bunch of good questions on Twitter. We had a good conversation going on Reddit.
Yeah.
I misread what people were saying and thought they were attacking us. And
you were a little bit
defensive.
You became a bit defensive there.
So we found a good listening crowd over at the game dev subreddit.
Yeah.
Because most of those folks end up having to, they approach it from the game dev perspective, but quickly encounter the business side of things. And I see a lot of questions popping up regarding like, how do I negotiate contracts? And I think that might be a future episode.
Yeah.
How to tackle contracts, but a bunch of good questions overall. I think a lot of good feedback, and the more feedback we get.
Oh yeah, man, that's amazing. Thanks everyone. I mean, it feels really good, and it's really useful to us because that helps us figure out what to talk about in upcoming episodes.
But undoubtedly, we got a lot of comments about DLC and the business model and BS like that, and it's just like I'm dying to tackle that subject. I've already written a bunch of show notes on that.
Yeah. The big sort of...
Why our business model is the best business model and why we will keep making DLC and more DLC and you will love it.
Yeah, this is a big, hairy one, right?
Yes.
I mean, we will definitely tackle this in an upcoming episode for sure, but I think we need to get a little bit up to speed first. Yeah. But yeah, it's coming. And also, I should say, by popular demand, the podcast is now on iTunes. It's on Acast. It's on pretty much every podcast platform imaginable, as far as I can tell. Just search for the Paradox podcast in your player of choice and you should find us there.
What about that giveaway you promised last time?
Of course I've sorted that out. I'm a man of my word.
Are you?
So yeah, we have 3 Steam codes for Teleglitch.
My favorite game.
Shams's favorite Paradox game to give away. How did you describe Teleglitch again?
It's a top-down Doom roguelike.
Top-down Doom roguelike. Who wouldn't want to play that, right? So we've got 3 codes to give away. If you want one, I think this is how we'll do this. If you want a code for Teleglitch, ping me on Twitter with the secret code word. The secret code word is Shams has impeccable taste. Shams has impeccable taste. Say that to me and I shall give you a code. So my Twitter handle is Daniel Goldberg, one word, but it's 0 instead of an O.
That's a terrible handle.
I know, it's a really bad Twitter handle, but that's where we are. So Daniel Goldberg with a 0 instead of an O in Goldberg. Ping me, tell me Shams has impeccable taste, and claim your free copy of Teleglitch today. So what are we going to talk about today then?
I think we're talking about the Humblebundle IGN thing. Did you read about this?
That's right. Yes, I did. Pretty cool news. IGN are acquiring Humblebundle. This is news that broke just a couple of days ago.
Yeah.
Pretty cool news, in my humble opinion.
Yeah. So let's talk about this. What's your take on this entire thing?
So, since I'm still kind of a journalist...
Wait. What does still mean? That you still have your degree? Is that... Do you write for press?
I don't.
You're not a journalist, my friend.
Since I used to be a journalist...
Yes, there we go.
Let's start with the media angle, I think.
Yeah.
So from an IGN perspective then, I think this is very, very clever, actually.
Yeah.
So IGN, as some people might know, is owned by Ziff Davis, which is a big publishing house, which is in turn owned by a company called J2 Global, a big internet services company. Now, unless IGN have figured something out that I'm not aware of, it's a very fair bet to say that they are struggling a little bit, just as every other media company in the world, with figuring out how to make money in a world where digital ad revenue is basically non-existent. This is the big sort of media crisis we're going through.
Right now. But, there is a lot of ad money, but it's being gobbled up by Google and Facebook?
Yeah, that's right. The money that used to support media businesses is now largely sucked up by big internet companies like Google and Facebook because, they're much better at serving page views and selling ads, essentially. So media companies overall are still trying to adapt to a world where I would say, one, good quality, free digital content is abundant. So unless you're extremely niche or extremely good at what you do, charging people for access to content online basically doesn't work.
Who is succeeding at being very niche and successful?
So the easy example is papers like the Financial Times, the Wall Street Journal. It's much easier to see sort of a direct relationship between paying for coverage and sort of having access to information that is valuable in itself if you look at financial journalism. In terms of sort of broader, more general publications, there are very, very few examples of people making this work. The Economist is an example people often bring up. Magazines like, what's it called? The one run by the wallpaper guy. Monocle is the name of the magazine. Sort of very niche publications that sort of sell access to a lifestyle as well.
Yeah, but I think that the rumor of the death of, modern media or print media or traditional media, all media really established through traditional means has been spoken about quite a while. But I was surprised to see that over 250 people work at IGN.
Yeah.
It's a giant, giant place.
But that's the point, isn't it? Like, it's a very resource-intensive business. Like, creating journalism takes resources, takes time, it's expensive, right?
Yeah.
So it's difficult because filling Facebook with content isn't expensive. Facebook just relies on users to do that for them. But sort of the second point I want to make is, and you sort of touched upon this, is ad rates online are plummeting. And this is, again, because companies like Google and Facebook can serve an almost infinite supply of very, very targeted page views much more efficiently than a sort of an old school media company can. Okay. So the media industry has been squeezed from two sides, right?
Okay, it sounds brutal. And I'm basing this mainly off how tough it sounds to be a journalist right now, making a living.
Yeah, you wouldn't believe. It's a nightmare. I mean, it's really hard. It's very, very hard today to make a living as a journalist. And it's for a lot of people, especially in games, it's sort of driven by passion. And there's nothing wrong with that.
And what does this mean in order to be able to survive then? If the situation is tough, and how does that tie back to the Humblebundle situation?
So basically what every media company is trying to do today is figure out other ways of making money on all of these eyeballs that you're attracting, right? Media companies are still good at attracting attention because you know people read and share stories or whatever, but the sort of underlying business model doesn't necessarily work anymore. So that needs to be replaced. Everyone is looking for a new business model.
Okay.
Right? So, and this is what I think is so interesting, because what IGN has now done is they haven't acquired a new business model, but they've acquired the potential for a new business model. As in, they now own an efficient, obviously very well-liked platform for selling and distributing games.
Yeah, let's recap a bit and say, like, IGN, for those that are not too familiar.
Yeah.
IGN is one of the biggest sites that cover games.
That's right,
online.
yeah.
And Humblebundle started as a small startup in the sense that they made bundles that were largely driven on the business model of you pay what you want, and a large part of this will go to charity.
Yes.
And it started way back when, and they've raised capital a couple of times. The last time, they actually raised $50 million.
Yeah.
So they're not a small 2-bit operation anymore.
That's right.
And they've started with those kind of charity kind of humbles, and they were very unique at the time when they popped up, and it was a very different way of, buying and consuming stuff. And I think most of us hardcore consumers,
this honor system, everything. Right? Pay what you will, and that actually works because people don't take stuff for free. They actually pay a decent amount if you ask them to pay what they think something's worth.
And this was during the heyday of, indies, and you had Notch popping into every bundle being the top contributor, and very different times. Back then, you could say.
Back in 2014.
Back in 2014, the 12. And they've changed over time, and they are a legitimate and big actor in the digital PC space.
They very recently introduced this monthly thing where you can subscribe to monthly bundles.
Monthly bundles. So I think that there's been a perception change, and a lot of people knew of them, what their older business was like with the bundles. But a big part of their business has been running as any digital distributor and storefront in recent years.
So the question is obviously what this means to them, but and sort of for their growth plans and ambitions going forward. But I think first of all, let me just make this final point about IGN. So without knowing the numbers, obviously, and it's always interesting to speculate, how about instead of looking at this like, IGN, this massive media company, has now acquired a small distribution platform for games, which is the way we tend to approach this deal. How about instead viewing it as you have this distribution platform for games, which suddenly owns a massive media business or a massive marketing machine on top? Because I think that's the interesting thought here. I think Humblebundle could be potentially the core of what IGN is a couple of years from now. Like IGN as a business would then be about distributing and selling games.
So are you saying then that the IGN's job will not be to drive page views for ads in general, but drive that traffic specifically to Humblebundle?
Yeah, it's a massive marketing department. That's essentially what it is. This is quite sort of, this is far ahead in the future, but I think that just opens up a whole lot of interesting possibilities. And it also opens up a whole lot of interesting questions on sort of editorial independence and trustworthiness.
So how do you keep those aside? I mean, do you trust an IGN review and how if there's a huge buy button next to the article saying buying it here?
Yeah, exactly. Would you?
I'm being cynical.
Yeah,
here.
would you?
No, probably not.
So that's the thing. I mean, there are ways around this, obviously. I mean, you can sort of quite easily create, and this is very common in journalism, you create a corporate structure where editorial teams are essentially isolated, insulated from sales teams. So the business side of the operation doesn't have any impact whatsoever on the sort of content side of the operation. That's very common.
But do people buy this?
But that's the thing. Like, it becomes an issue, and it's not necessarily about there being actual bias, because usually there isn't, but it's often, and I know because I used to work with this stuff, but it's often about avoiding the impression of bias, which might not even be possible.
I don't know. I think the waters are muddled anyway.
So picture this, right?
Yeah.
You're a games reviewer. You leave Paradox for an illustrious career as a games reviewer. Your childhood dream, right?
Okay.
So Shams is just being quiet here. But yeah, let's say you're a games reviewer.
Pause, yeah.
You play a game. Let's say for the sake of argument that you play Stellaris, published by, coincidence, us here at Paradox.
Okay.
And you love Stellaris, right? You think it's it's one of the best sci-fi strategy games ever published. You know, it's thousands of hours of gameplay, insane depth, wonderful writing, lots of really interesting systems that sort of interlock. Yeah, as you would, right?
I would score it high.
You awarded a score of 9 out of 10, right? And you do this completely on your own. You're not pressured by some sales guy into doing this or whatever. This is just your opinion. However, literally right underneath the review you've just published, there's a huge offer to buy Stellaris directly from the outlet you are working with at a very attractive rate. You as a journalist had nothing to do with this, but it kind of looks a bit weird, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's very suspicious. Then again, I mean, every review page is already filled with ads to buy that game if whoever's publishing it is doing a good job of their ad spend anyway.
Yeah.
But you're saying that link will only go to one place now.
Well, that's certainly a potential here. Or at least you could, if you take that perspective, you could say that the point of IGN's, this is looking way ahead in the future, obviously, but sort of extrapolating on what's happened, you could say that the purpose of IGN's editorial business would now be to drive game sales. That's very different from driving page views. And that opens up all of these very tricky questions.
Yes, there are a lot of questions surrounding this.
But I think the key here is this. Even if we assume that IGN have nothing but good intentions here, and I think they do, I think they have a massive communications challenge ahead of them. It's about sort of not destroying the brand goodwill that they've acquired here via Humblebundle, because Humblebundle is a very well-liked operations, right? People tend to like Humble. Yeah. And also sort of retaining their trustworthiness as an independent source of information. I mean, people would argue if they are, but let's assume that they are a trusted source of information.
I mean, I often use Reddit as a kind of litmus test of how people are reacting to things, maybe erroneously so. But initial reactions were not amazing among some of the Humblebundle fans. I don't know if IGN has specific fans in that sense. But did you notice the timing of the announcement?
No.
It was the news was released on a Friday. Late on Friday. What does that tell you, Mr. Journalist Man?
Well, that tells the reason you choose to release news late on a Friday is because you're working on the assumption that most journalists have gone home.
So you don't
This is
want
true, right?
the news to be picked up.
No, well, you're going to get pickup, but you're not going to get lots of follow-ups, and you're kind of assuming that when people come into work on Monday morning,
there's a bigger news that's...
Yeah, they've forgotten about this, they've moved on to other things. You're kind of trying to avoid lots of analysis, sort of follow-up interviews. You're kind of trying to avoid people talking about stuff in podcasts.
Okay, right.
So very perceptive of you. I didn't think of that, actually.
Thank you. Maybe...
We have a couple of openings in marketing, actually, if you're interested.
I wouldn't be adverse to that. So let's look at it from this other perspective, and that's Humblebundle's perspective.
Yeah, let's look at it from the Humble perspective. What's your... do you think this makes sense for Humblebundle?
I think that I don't want to be too presumptuous to talk about their strategies, because it's a bit hard to glean from the outside, and I can tell you this from being on the inside at Paradox on a management level, being a public company, and then hearing all the so-called analysts or hobby analysts looking at the things we do and say and try to draw conclusions for that. So I've become very, very more humble in quickly judging what other people are doing, because it could look like, there's a mad chicken at the end of the...
it's easy to have opinions, right?
It's very easy to have opinions, right? So, but I mean, on one perspective, it's obviously money for the founders of Humblebundle. I'm assuming they fetched a handsome price tag. On the other side, I think that Humblebundle might be making a bigger strategic move into focusing their business on a particular part of the industry. They've always had this stronger focus on indies rather than AAA.
Yeah,
they've had AAA, but it's been kind of the mainstay of many of the indies. They've always had the Humble Store widget thingy, which allows essentially any indie to set up their own store and just use their kind of white label solution for selling games. So maybe it's a bigger play there to become a more ubiquitous solution for everything else. What we're seeing on Steam, and one of the analysts I follow on Twitter just tweeted yesterday we passed more games released on Steam this year compared to last year, and it's just October now.
Yeah. So you're saying this could be an opening to apply the sort of Humble model to AAA games?
Maybe, and it might be just a counter move to the discoverability problem that exists on Steam right now. It's hard to notice stuff, so maybe I'm just speculating.
A more curated alternative.
Maybe a more curated alternative is that's the go-to place for the best indie games to find them.
I've got to be honest, I don't really understand what the Humble guys get out of this, except of course the money. We don't know much about why they sold either. I mean, the only thing that's been communicated is that they chose IGN because they, and I quote, really understand our vision, share our passion for games, and believe in our mission to promote awesome digital content while helping charity. So that's basically not an explanation at all, right? That's cleverly worded press release.
A bit like a canned response.
So do you know Jeffrey or John, the founders of Humblebundle?
I've met both, but I've talked to John several times. He's a very cool dude and is very relaxed, and you can be very cynical when it comes to these things, but I think they've paid out $106 million in charity.
It's pretty amazing.
It's
$106 million.
Million dollars. So you should definitely not knock them. They worked hard for this, so whatever kind of payday they're getting, they fully deserve it.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
for sure. I don't think that they're lying. Absolutely not. I think that there is something else at play here, but it's maybe not that evident. But I think the interesting part of it is not necessarily the specifics of this deal, but rather that it allows us to then approach it from a perspective of what other macro trends are happening in the industry that allow us to look at this.
We should probably mention then also that we, just for sake of transparency, we as Paradox have a pretty good relationship with Humblebundle as well.
For sure.
We've done a couple of deals with them, and they've worked out very well, to my knowledge. My impression that I get is that people in general in the industry think they are genuinely nice, cool people to work with. They're very. My feeling overall is that they're very well respected and liked in the trade, right?
Yeah.
So having said that, what's your take on this then?
I mean, we see this happening. There's other examples of this happening in this industry. Game bought Multiplay in the UK. Game was the runner of the retail stores, and as you know, physical sales in our business is doing quite poorly and diminishing over time. Destiny 2 was reported to just sell half of the retail units Destiny 1 did, which is a completely moot comparison. Who gives a shit about how it did there, because everything is becoming more digital all the time. in the case of, for instance, when Amazon purchased Twitch, or even better, when they bought Whole Foods, it was obviously very clear what the strategic play was, especially when Amazon also released that video of fully automated grocery stores. You could clearly see that there's an expansion in strategy there. There is a plan, but I think it's hard to see. For a developer that has a large percentage of their business through Humblebundle, I think that it would be good to keep an eye on this.
Yeah.
In the short term, I don't think there's going to be any kind of change.
But I mean, the interesting point here, I think, is if you look at sort of distribution platforms, looking a couple of years ahead in the future, do you think there is a future for independent distribution platforms, as in alternatives to Steam?
Absolutely. Let's remember that. I think Steam is about 12 to 17% of the PC market in total. Yeah. Like, if we talk about Western indie and AAA games, PC games, yes, Steam is a very big part of the cake, but it is the ecosystem today looks very different from the ancient history of 2014 or 12. I think there's a lot to say there, but there's absolutely more room, and I think I'm very excited to see what Humble and IGN do together in the future.
Because I mean, from the outside looking in, it's easy to get the impression that PC games and Steam are synonymous. Like, if you're on Steam, that's it. You cover the market. That's the platform you need. Is that the case today?
I think it pegs a bigger point, but I think that the answer is, if you're an independent developer that has one or two titles, then you have to marshal your resources, and then just focusing on Steam is absolutely good enough. If you start to reach a kind of bigger size, if you have a bigger portfolio, you're not only on, you're on other platforms, other consoles, then just limiting yourself to Steam might be just that, a limitation.
Because the assumption then would be it's not necessarily the case that in the future Steam will be as dominant as it is today?
Maybe.
Sensitive topic this, right?
No, maybe yes or no. Not really.
All right. So, speaking of distribution platforms.
That was the worst segue ever.
See what I did? That's called a transition.
So, okay, continue. Let's see where you go with this.
Let's talk about our own distribution platform.
Yes, absolutely. But I mean, kidding aside, it's an interesting topic. It might sound like a stupid plug of our platform or a boring topic at first, but I think it is one of the big macro trends that's going on in the industry right now. If you're a small indie, you probably are not affected by this in the short term, but if you plan on becoming successful long term, or if you are a mid or a bigger developer, this is a big thing happening, right? With distribution platforms and the democratization, if you want, of the marketplace as a whole. So I think that everything is kind of interconnected, and even if you're not seeing the effects right now, you'll definitely see this happening more and more distribution platforms.
So we run our own storefront. It's called Paradox Plaza. Since a couple of months back, you can buy Paradox games and run them independently of Steam using our own Paradox launcher. So this is quite sort of early stages. Stellaris and Tyranny are the only games you can play on this now. And this might not seem like a big deal from the outside, but internally, I mean, creating these so-called sort of Steam independent builds of our games is kind of a big deal, right? It takes a bit of work. I don't think, again, this was news to me when I joined the industry. I don't think many people outside the industry know that Steam is, a lot more than just a storefront. It's kind of, I mean, would it be correct to describe it as a platform in its own right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Steam is several things at the same time. It's just not distribution. It's, at least before the influx of a lot of games, that was where you went to discover new games. It really was. But it has, for developers, it's a godsend in the sense that it just simplifies developers' lives so much by giving ancillary features and benefits so that you don't have to build it yourself in the game.
Yeah.
And also, you're building yourself deeper into the Steam ecosystem, but it's, a lot of people don't remember or may have heard tales of the hardships of PC development before Steam came along.
Right.
It was, Steam's biggest selling point is still, the automated updating of games. But Steam has a lot of benefits for developers for sure.
So, looking at it from a publisher's perspective, what's the value here for us then, as in creating our own platform? I mean, First of all, we should probably say that we love Steam. We have Steam to thank for a lot of our business. We do very well on Steam.
I often say that Steam is single-handedly the best thing that's happened to Western gaming.
Yeah, and that obviously includes Paradox, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So Steam is fantastic. That's a bit of a disclaimer.
Yeah.
But sort of having said that, I think it's obviously quite dangerous for us to put all our eggs in one basket, as it were. That doesn't necessarily mean Steam, but it sort of means all distribution platforms that aren't ours, but that we rely on. We work obviously with the Humblebundle guys. We work with Good Old Games, Greenman Gaming, plenty of others. But in theory, all of these could disappear, right?
Yes, I mean, so I think Steam may be a part of the rosy kind of aura around Steam has fallen a little bit over the years. They could do almost no fault a few years ago, and more critical voices are being raised now. That said, it's very easy to shit on the market leader for sure, and it's not completely fair at all times. But what we see, and I'll probably come back to this later, is that on a macro level, we see players' behaviors changing by and large. 6-7 years ago, when Uplay or Origin was launched, most people were groaning and they were like, I have to get my game on another platform. I just want to play my games on Steam.
Yeah.
But player behavior is very different today. Now everyone has a Battle.net account. They've played games through it. They are used to an Origin account, a Uplay account, and people are just used to having accounts in different places and consuming. It's the threshold and pain of going to another platform is not as high. And we see this exact same thing when it comes to audiobooks. When it comes to TV shows and movies, people have their Netflix, they have their Hulus, they have their Amazons, they have their HBOs, right? So people today consume media in a very different way compared to 5, 6, 7 years ago. And people are more used to a more granulated market and more distributed marketplace rather than just one-stop shop for everything.
Yeah, but that obviously isn't I suppose the point I wanted to make is that the reason why it sort of makes strategic sense for us to build our own platform is we need a way of selling games that we are in control of, that we're not reliant on anyone else. We also need the opportunity or the possibility to communicate directly with our gamers, as in connect directly with our fans and our customers that doesn't require someone else as the middleman. So those are the sort of strategic reasons for this, right?
There are actually other reasons as well. And this, we come back to this again. If you just have one game in your portfolio, you're exposed to so much risk anyway. So it's, the question of like, should I diversify from Steam doesn't make a lot of sense. But when you reach Paradox size and you have 10, 15 or 100 games in our portfolio as is, you just need to start looking at your business model and make sure that you are protected from external factors. I'll give you a concrete example of something that changed in the marketplace that affected us quite a lot, but it meant the end for other companies. And this is, one thing I'll be repeating during this podcast is that operating in the games industry is like running a marathon. It's not a sprint. You have to set yourself up for the long haul, right? So a few years ago, Steam rolled out their new refund policy. Before that, there was basically, you had to go through the process of kind of emailing Steam, hoping that they responded to you and maybe you got a refund. But what they did then was that they rolled out a policy that said if you played the game for less than 2 hours, you can refund it, no questions asked. It's automatic. So what happened? Of course, at the same time, demos more or less died on Steam. So that saved resources for a bunch of people. But of course, our return rates just shot up a lot. And they had like a 6-month grace period or whatever. But for anyone who's played a Paradox game knows that 2 hours barely gets you through the main menu, let alone, the starting points of the game, right? So for us, our games operate according to a business model that stands the test of external factors like this. We didn't know that Steam was planning this, or we knew that they were talking about it, but we didn't know that we were going to roll it out on Tuesday. But what happened was that if you were an indie, or let's say even Telltale, and some of their great games...
Telltale are the developers of games like the Walking Dead series and what's another Telltale series?
They've done the Game of Thrones games. So they do narrative, click and play adventure games of that sort. And a lot of their games are playable and finishable in about 2 hours. There are a bunch of other indies that have are very narrative and story-driven games that are smaller products, and you can totally experience them in the span of 2 hours. What happened for them is that policy completely killed their business model.
Yeah,
so
you can finish the game and return it.
Exactly. So it comes back to whenever you're running a business, you have to ask yourself, like, is my business model robust enough to survive the changing market conditions? And that's where we're back to, how is the market changing? And when it comes to distribution channels, is that for a very simple reason, just having all your eggs in one basket is not sound business. And we're never going to move away from Steam. We love Steam. We're doing great. We're never going to stop selling games there. But just from a risk perspective, any developer that's looking at this needs to ask themselves, can I make more money off other places? And what happens if something sudden happens with Steam?
So exactly. But to your point about, yes, the sort of media environment is changing, and people today are probably not as averse to having, working with several distribution platforms as people were a couple of years back. But having said that, that's still not something we can sort of take for given, obviously. I mean, there needs to be a very clear value proposition in our platform. Like, we can't just assume that just because we offer something called a Paradox account, everyone's going to sign up for it.
And I think that we can liken it to the situation where we had a few years ago with a disastrous Microsoft kind of gaming platforms, Games for Live Windows.
Yeah.
I don't even remember the name of it, but everyone remembers the horrible experience. Yeah. And it was like this platform within a platform, and everyone just pulling their hair saying, like, why should I engage with this? And this is what it comes back to, like, and what we talk about constantly, and we're not good at it. We're not good enough at it, I'd say. But you described it precisely right. For us, it's like, unless we can create a compelling value proposition, a reason for you to register an account and play through there, if we can't do that, we've failed. So
exactly.
The onus is on us. Yeah. And, we need to be able to create that value, right?
Yeah. We need to figure out what will make people feel like it's worth their time and efforts to use this platform instead of another one, right?
Exactly.
And I think it's, we might as well be transparent. We don't know yet. This is what we work on now. This is what we're trying to, figure out. I think what we can do is maybe share a couple of thoughts, like
hypothetical examples,
like hypotheticals of the things we've been discussing. What we could. Cool things that we could potentially do with our own platform that we couldn't necessarily do as easily on someone else's, right? Yeah. So, for example, with a sort of multiplayer backend owned by us, we could, in theory, no promises, quite easily implement cross-platform multiplayer play between console and PC players, if that makes sense.
Actually, I'll counter that and say console is not possible because that platform is owned by Sony and Microsoft in that sense. But let's say if you buy the game on Good Old Games and I buy it on Steam, we could play against each other.
All right, fair enough. You're not boxed in by your platform of choice, right?
What else?
We could build pretty cool systems for hot loading mods, for adding new quests, adding new events to games in real time. We could potentially do pretty sweet offers based on what games you own and what games you play.
Like a loyalty system. The longer you've been a user of our platform, the bigger discounts you get.
For example, do you own all games developed by PDS, our internal development studio? All right, congratulations.
Here's your Paradox that gives me access to all those games.
Have you paid for them with your own money?
Never.
All right, but if you had, we could pretty easily say, congratulations, here's a free ticket to PDXCon this year. Right? Okay. So that's something we could implement quite easily.
Are you planning that?
What's that?
Are you planning that?
We'll see. It would be pretty cool, right? Yeah. So, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that we could do quite easily on our own platform, but it might be difficult to do that on someone else's.
So, but the trick is obviously, you need to create a strong value proposition where people understand and clearly understand why should you doing it. Like, we talked about this many years ago. A lot of games you start playing, they're like, please register, blah, blah, blah. And they never quite tell you what the benefit is for you for registering. Like, if you want customer support, then you're like, well, I'll get in touch with you if I need customer support. But you're not getting an additional value there. And I think that relating back to how is this applicable for other developers is that maybe you're not building your own platform, but essentially maybe you're offering a lot of these things through your own games. You can create these things in your games, right? Where you're rewarded for owning... you bought our first game, we're giving you something in the second game and rewarding you for that loyalty. So that's I think, something we need to focus on. And a large part of it is, again, people need to tell us what they'd be willing to pay or with how they think that we can create value. If they tell us that this would be good for them, we can probably create it. I think that one of the best experiences we've had is when we went and just asked the community, what would you like to see in the next expansion for Hearthstone 2 or whatever it was. We had the manpower and time there to just create exactly more or less, take the requests and put them together into a thing.
Yeah, so I mean, perhaps we will get the answer to this as a comment to this podcast. We'll see, I suppose. But this is stuff that we try to figure out, and we haven't got any sort of clear answers to any of this yet. But yeah, it's a big challenge for us, and I think it's something that will be pretty important for us going forward. So we ended our last podcast with a couple of lists.
Yeah.
That I thought that was quite good. So I thought we'd do the same exercise again.
Okay, what's the list this time?
So we've been talking about acquisitions, right? The IGN Humblebundle acquisition. So top 3 acquisitions that haven't happened yet, but we would like to see in the games industry.
Would you like to start?
I'll start.
Okay.
Microsoft buys Valve.
No way ever.
Why not?
I don't know how much of this has been publicized, but my understanding is that a certain Mr. Newell is not a big fan of Microsoft.
Yeah.
At least through how he talks about Microsoft constantly being this walled garden, and he used to work at Microsoft, right? Yeah. I think that would never happen because as long as Gabe is in the picture, I don't think that they'd sell to the...
So you're saying that even if Microsoft offered, Valve would say no because of cultural fit? Like
yes,
a lack of cultural fit.
Yes. It just, I don't see it making sense. Like every part of their strategy thus far has been to create a counterpart to Microsoft. And I don't think that the long-term plan has then been built to build such a value that then they can fetch a even higher price from Microsoft. I don't think that's...
Would it make sense from a Microsoft perspective though? Like, you know, if you decide to, you're laughing here.
I'm laughing now because I'm thinking about,
I'm thinking, wouldn't it make sense to just, if you decide that you want to own the PC gaming space, if you were to acquire the biggest distribution platform and,
You're saying that the Windows 10 store is not the biggest PC gaming platform for...
I suppose in
PC
terms
games?
of, technically I suppose in terms of users, but who uses that? I don't...
It's kind of an evil joke. So I'm giving Microsoft a hard time, but they've been clearly trying to get their Windows 10 store to kind of be that counterpart because they obviously own the operative system that the OS that everyone's using for PC gaming. But they've had a hard time. They've had a number of exclusives on the Windows 10 store. Halo Wars 2, Age of Empires 4 is coming out, and that's also Windows 10 store exclusive. So we'll see what happens. I think that it would make a lot of sense for Microsoft, but
Valve would say no.
Absolutely.
All right, now that's a fair counterpoint. What do you think then, Champs? Who's going to acquire who?
I don't know. I think it's very hard to say. I don't. Nothing immediate pops up, but I'll again relate back to the kind of on a macro level.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you this: that any developer who is right now, everyone in the middle is getting squeezed.
Yeah.
Actually, like more or less everyone is getting squeezed. On the bottom, people in the indies are getting squeezed. It's hard business to survive on Steam. The mid-sized developers, and there was an excellent article in Gamasutra just a week ago where Brian Fargo and others were interviewed about how expensive it is to run an established, well-running studio of a certain caliber. If we're not talking about a total indie, you're making this, if you have a 50-man studio, essentially, you are in a lot of ways competing against the big boys. Let's use our friends down the street, Fat Shark, as an example.
Yeah,
they make action games. They use a big license, the Warhammer license. Their games look fairly...
Fat Shark, we should say, is a Stockholm-based developer. Most recently, they've been working on the Vermintide games.
Vermintide game. They're revealing Vermintide 2 today. In the past, we worked with them on War of the Roses, War of the Vikings, the ill-fated War of the Vikings, and Lead and Gold. They're great bunch. But
was Lead and Gold published by Paradox?
Yes, it was.
Oh, cool!
Actually.
I did not know that.
It sold a tremendous amount of copies, and it was one of the main reasons why we ultimately ended up doing Magical Wizard Wars, because we were like, this multiplayer game that was kind of put together quite quickly did quite well. Multiplayer games seem to be doing like gangbusters.
Sure.
Let's do a MOBA, more or less.
Yeah.
That didn't work out. Anyway, coming back to I sidebarred. They're making action games on a big license. Their games look fairly well. Essentially, they are competing for attention against the Battlefields and Destinies. But obviously, they're not AAA. But making those games still require a very high degree of competency. So they have to hire people that can make those type of games. But obviously, it's incredibly hard for a small or mid-sized developer to compete with the salaries that an Activision or a DICE has. So right now, I think that some mid-sized developers are really finding success, but the cost of operating their business is incredibly hard. In general, I think they're standing in front of this kind of challenge. Either we take an investment and can then become our own publisher and build our own platform and have longevity through those means, or we get acquired by somebody else and just become their box.
So mid-sized studios that are sort of highly specialized and well-known for one type of game specifically are interesting acquisitions targets.
And I'll give you a couple of examples on one that relates back to Paradox. Triumph is a very good example.
Triumph is a studio based in the Netherlands that we acquired earlier this year, most famous for the Age of Wonders series.
The Age of Wonders series, exactly. And another example is Amplitude in France, who were acquired by Sega.
That's right.
So I think that there are a bunch of other really talented developers that are in the range of 20 to 50 developers that have had some success, but maybe are looking at the Steam marketplace right now and realizing that kind of Kickstarter campaign we did a couple of years ago is not going to work, and once it comes to market, it might tank horrendously. Being bought now is actually maybe not a terrible thing.
Yeah.
And also
to give you the muscle and the security you need to bring your games to market. Right?
And the reason why there's a huge disparity in cost is that when you're an indie, you're generally young, you don't have a family, a mortgage, it's fine. But once you have 2 kids and a mortgage, you can't work for peanuts, and the cost of things go up, right? So it's a tough spot, I think.
Who's going to buy you then? Who's
buying us?
No, not us, but all of these hypothetical mid-sized studios that you're describing. Who's the purchaser?
Hypothetical mid to big-sized publishers.
Right.
I think I think it's actually rougher than that. Tencent is kind of buying everyone right now, which is cool in a lot of ways because
Tencent owns a 5% stake in Paradox, we should also say, for transparency's sake.
Yeah, they're gobbling up just about everything. They own about 12% of Activision, and all of Riot, and a bunch of other developers. So I think it's them, but if you look at the really, really, really big studios or publishers, I don't think they're interested in buying mid-sized developers. They need AAA products, right? So buying a fat shark maybe isn't an option, and that's why maybe they will be bought by the market by doing IPOs.
All right. I'm not sure if that was a top 3 or a top 10 or a top...
Take it as you will.
Yeah, but it was interesting. It's a good discussion there. Thank you, Shams. I think that's it for episode 2.
You didn't have any other acquisition?
Well, it felt like you had you'd been thinking about this, obviously. So I feel a bit like the one I wrote down is quite similar to the point you're making, is Activision after Blizzard and after King, right?
Yeah.
So Activision have made these 2 massive acquisitions, Blizzard and King, obviously. No. What's next then? I mean, I suppose counter to your argument, based on past acquisitions, they go very broad. They don't acquire niche players. They acquire, the leading studio in the MMO space, the leading mobile player. What's next then? I mean, a big, an Asian MMO developer maybe, or something like that?
No, I think that our points coincide in the sense that the really big ones are not interested in smaller players. They have to make really big.
Yeah.
It has to be deals in the magnitude of King.
So perhaps if Tencent hadn't acquired Riot Games, League of Legends, that would have been an interesting target for acquisition. Yeah. All right. Cool. Fair point. This is the kind of stuff we could get paid a lot more money of if we're right. This is all right. I think that's it. That's the end of episode 2 of the Paradox podcast. As always, thank you very much for listening. Let us know what you think. We're on Twitter. You can probably find us if you Google our names. And as always, tell us what you'd like to hear more about. Tell us what you'd like to hear less about. And we shall have another episode ready for you in about 2 weeks. Thank you.
Goodbye.